Good morning. Today we meet to consider several nominations as well as sentencing reform. And after a tragedy like we had yesterday at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, it's pretty difficult to start a meeting without some consideration of that. And there's not easy to say anything about it, but we obviously express our sympathy to the victims of the tragedy and their families. I suppose we have to remember the difficult time that first responders have and everybody else that tries to work to comfort and help people get better. We know that the shooter was a former student, killing 17 and injuring 23. We know that it's senseless and cowardly violence. I've talked some to the press about it, but it's difficult, and I suppose maybe, like I heard Senator Rubio say yesterday, we probably ought to wait till we get the facts, but there is one common denominator. Besides the common denominator of guns, there is the common denominator of in a lot of these shootings of the mental illness of the people that we have. But it's a difficult situation, and I'm probably not very good at expressing that, and I know other members will want to speak to that point as well. I'll go now to our agenda. Jonathan Mitchell, who is nominated to be the chairman of the Administrative Conference of the United States, is on the agenda for the first time. The minority has requested that his nomination be held over, and let's see, we have 5. We have enough so that we can hold that over. That's both parties present by at least 2 members, so that nomination will be held over. The first nominee that we'll consider today is Michael Brennan, nominated to be the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals. Judge Brennan is a well-respected former state trial court judge and assistant district attorney for Milwaukee. He's received broad bipartisan support from Wisconsin legal community, including the longtime former Milwaukee district attorney. And also, to my friends on the other side, Judge Brennan received a unanimously well-qualified rating from the ABA. Today, we're also marking up the Sentencing Reform and Correction Act. This legislation reforms mandatory minimum prison sentences to focus on the most serious drug offenders and violent criminals. This is a bipartisan bill that cuts costs, reduces crime, and optimizes the criminal justice system. It is supported by a diverse array of groups like Freedom Works, the American Conservative Union, Prison Fellowship, Families and Mandatory Minimums, the NFL, the ACLU, and the NAACP. Just that group, and there are probably dozens of other groups that's backing it, you ought to stop to think about the diverse political opinion there. Probably this might be the only thing that they agree on as a justification for moving this bill forward. It is also a bill with policies that enjoy broad national support. A recent poll showed that the American people strongly support improving our criminal justice system. 87% of Americans, 83% of Republicans, and I hope that doesn't imply Republicans aren't Americans, believe that the mandatory minimums for nonviolent offenders should be replaced by a system focused on judicial discretion. 76% Americans and 68% of Republicans believe the criminal justice system needs significant improvements. 87% of Americans, 80% of the Republicans think that we're spending too much money on prisons that should be used instead for treatment, rehabilitation, law enforcement, and victim services. The bill gives judges additional discretion in sentencing defendants with minimal nonviolent criminal histories that may trigger mandatory minimum sentences under the current law. It also applies some of these reforms retroactively, including the Fair Sentencing Act. But before this happens, judges must first review eligible inmates' individual cases, including criminal histories and conduct while incarcerated, to determine whether sentence reduction is appropriate. Importantly, the bill preserves cooperation incentives to aid law enforcement in tracking down kingpins and stiffens penalties for individuals convicted of serious violent felonies. It also adds new mandatory minimums for certain crimes involving interstate domestic violence and provisions of weapons to terrorists and prohibited countries. Additionally, it creates a new 5-year sentencing enhancement for trafficking of heroin laced with fentanyl. The bill establishes recidivism reduction programs to help prepare low-risk inmates to successfully re-enter society. Qualifying inmates may receive reductions to their sentences through time credits upon successful completion of recidivism reduction programs. Our justice system demands consequences for those who choose to run afoul of the law, and law enforcement works hard to keep our communities safe. This bipartisan compromise ensures that these consequences fit their crime by targeting violent and career criminals who prey on innocents while giving nonviolent offenders with minimal criminal histories a better chance to become productive members of society. This bill strikes the right balance of improving public safety and ensuring fairness in criminal justice system. Yesterday, Attorney General Sessions sent us a letter setting forth his views on Sentencing Reform and Correction Act. When I read this letter, it was almost as if it was Senator Sessions being back on this committee and not General Sessions. But that's a problem. He's now Attorney General and is charged with executing the laws that Congress passes, not interfering with the legislative process. Certainly, we value input from DOJ, but if General Sessions wanted to be involved in marking up this legislation, maybe he should have quit his job, as was talked about last November, and be a Republican Senate seat now held by a Democrat from Alabama. I've talked to Attorney General Sessions about this bill many times. He opposes the elimination of mandatory minimums. I've told everybody on this committee I do as well. He believes in being tough on crime, and so do most of the people on this committee. But I also believe in being fair. This is a view shared by the last Republican Attorney General, Michael McCasey, who testified in support of this bill last Congress. So we have one Republican Attorney General who thinks this bill is good policy, and one who has some concerns. I would also note, before I go on, just thinking on what I just read, I'm not sure my staff has expressed it the same way that I feel about this. I consider General Sessions a friend. I think we've worked together so many times over a long period of time. I'm really irritated that he would send that letter, considering the fact that it was very controversial before this committee to be Attorney General, considering that most of the assistant attorney generals have been sent up here. It's been very controversial and difficult to get through this committee, considering the fact that the president was going to fire him last spring, and I went to his defense. I don't think that's something that somebody should do to friends. Now, I know friends can disagree on issues, but this is something that he knows where I stood. He knows how hard it was to work out this compromise between Lee and Durbin on one side and Senator Grassley on the other side. And worse yet, I just heard this morning that maybe this letter went through OMB so the White House approves of it. For the very same reasons that I've done things trying to help an administration to be successful, if they're involved in this letter, that also irritates me. Now, let me continue. This group unites more than 200 current and former police chiefs, sheriffs, district attorneys, U.S. attorneys, and attorney generals from all 50 states. I'd like to quote from their letter. Quote, "Today, our oversized prison population costs taxpayers billions annually and draw law enforcement resources away from apprehending violent offenders. This legislation would free funding and time for officers to focus on targeting and preventing violent crimes, making our streets safer," end of quote. Without objection, I'll enter this letter into the record along with two other letters. The first is from the Pew Charitable Trust and describes how the state-level reforms this bill is based on have worked to protect public safety, hold offenders accountable, and cut costs. The second is from the Judicial Conference of the United States and describes the strong support of the judiciary for many of the reforms in the bill. This bill is good public policy. It is a result of years of careful negotiation. We've demonstrated that this bill has significant bipartisan support. 22 U.S. senators are already co-sponsors compared to 38 that we had at the end of the last Congress. And that includes more than half of the members of this committee. I look forward to continuing to work with the administration and the House on legislative solutions that the President can sign into law.